The Jets have a GM of the Year candidate, and this candidate might be up for bringing in a big defender. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we're starting off with a big nomination for Kevin Cheveldayoff as one of the three finalists for GM of the Year. Very controversial. I don't think he really deserves it in a lot of ways. Compared to some of the other candidates, you've got Jim Nill as one of the guys who's running for that trophy. So for me, Nill obviously is the clear winner here. The whole Rantanen trade and how he's built some of that playoff roster and where they are right now in the postseason, I think is a pretty fair reflection of his run. But that doesn't mean that Cheveldayoff hasn't done some good work prior to the season. We'll dive into a little bit of that, as well as some ways that he might be in line to make a big, defender acquisition. We talked yesterday about Winnipeg needing some centers, like a 2C more specifically, and maybe, just maybe, the same sort of logic is going to apply to not only the trade market for defenders, but the free agent market. There's some good stuff out there and a lot of bad stuff. So we'll dive into all of that. But first, let's talk about Chevy's qualifications to be GM of the Year. So this award's a very interesting one, right? I look at it, if you're thinking about a year-over-year situation, Chevy has been one of the better GMs over the last several years, and I really feel like this season was probably the first one in a long time where I sort of felt like he fell short of the mark. It's very rare that I've had to say much about his recent moves that I haven't been thrilled with. You know, you look at the Dubois trade and the McGroarty move, how the Jets have managed to extricate themselves back and forth from lots of really not great situations. And generally speaking, the Jets have done a pretty good job. You know, they got out from under the Wheeler contract. They worked themselves out of some tough contracts like Schmidt, buying him out as well, and they are almost free and clear of some of these cap holdings that have been sitting there for the past couple of years. Now, some of these cap hits are relatively low, not a big deal in dead money, but certainly not something that you just want to have sitting there. And it's always a reminder that when you sign long-term deals, you need to be smart about who you're doing it for and for how long. So for the Jets, obviously, the Schmidt one was a trade, not really something that they expected to have to do, I think, just a little bit into his contract. But, you get up there in your 30s, and now he's down in Florida thriving with the Panthers and Maurice again. So good on Schmidt. Glad that's out of the way. But I think for Chevy, we're looking at his case for being GM of the Year this season. And I really feel like this year is a very funny one to nominate him for, because a lot of what he did was more stuff that happened prior to the season. I think that this team has been set up for really good regular season success for a while now. I've talked about it repeatedly. I've said the thing that they really struggle with is just what happens when they get to the playoffs. And for the first time this year in some time, the Jets actually won a playoff series and started winning actual games. They even got a couple of games in the second round where they started to get a little bit closer, even though they weren't quite at the level that they needed to be. But the Jets, I think, have had some stronger moments. I think that there's been some real growth in the org and some real progress. It's just when I look at the actual body of work this season specifically, I'm surprised that Chevy wasn't really a finalist in previous years, but is this season. And, obviously the President's Trophy is an amazing accomplishment. Arneal is a great first-year full-time head coach. Quibbles with some of his lineup choices aside, he has shown some growth. I think he's changed a lot since those Columbus days. And so for the Jets, this is a really strong season and a big resume builder if you're looking to try and point to a track record of success. But for me, if I'm just taking a time period, right, this season just doesn't feel like the one that I would point to as evidence of where Chevy has gotten a lot right. I think in previous years, I was generally very impressed with his work. Even last year's trade deadline, I thought was better than this year's. Monahan and Toffoli obviously didn't quite work out when it came to the postseason, and I think we saw that the whole foot speed thing became a very quick problem with that whole team, and certainly with some of the ways that the Jets tried to play in the postseason. But when I look at this year, he brought in Shen and Tanev, and I don't know that he necessarily was intending to make them his primary targets. I've said this before. I think it was always supposed to be Brock Nelson. I think the Isles leveraged the Jets to try and get more from the Colorado Avalanche. That happened. And so I think in a lot of ways, Winnipeg really swung and just missed, right? They flat out missed at the trade deadline. Shen and Tanev brought some value during the regular season, and they were certainly fun to watch, throwing some big hits. But if you look at how much they actually moved the needle, I think we all know the answer to that, right? Other teams brought in some big star caliber players. The Stars made some surprising changes and swings. Swapping Stankoven for Rantanen, I don't think was really on my bingo card. Adding Grodlin, that's a modest choice, and certainly a guy who's improved their scoring depth. But you look at how Nil sort of approached that trade deadline, and it makes the Jets look like they're playing in a different league. And so for me, Chevy, I think, has done it was a step back for the front office this year. That's how I look at it, right? I think the hirings coming into the season were good. So on that, off-season move, I think that's a positive change. But I look at some of the other decisions, signing Neil Pionk for a fairly long contract, that one could age a little on the rough side. It would be very funny if Pionk is just a regular season average kind of guy, but then hits the playoffs and becomes a stud. If that's what he does, I'm okay with it. But I'm not putting all of my eggs in that basket. So for me, I just, Chevy was fine. I don't think that he's done particularly well this season. And I really feel like, thinking about the trade deadline, some of the lack of roster movement and some of the commitments that they've made to a couple of players who I'm not really sure I would do the same with, it leaves me in a tough spot. Do I think he's a good GM? Absolutely. And I think the previous years are very strong evidence that he's among the best with some really difficult circumstances, especially when you look at how he's gotten this team out of some bad situations. McGroarty wanting to walk, Dubois forcing his way out. A lot of players that the Jets, quite frankly, were hoping to build into this core have asked for ways out. And Chevy has managed to turn a lot of those situations into some surprising victories. Velarde is pretty good, and I think he's going to be a stable member of this core for the future, even if maybe he has some injury risks. Iafallo has already become a steadfast bottom six fan favorite and a guy that I really like in some surprisingly versatile roles. Kupari has played a few minutes, and Alphonse Frey, in the future should be a quality defender of some sort. We'll have to see where he sort of slots in with Winnipeg's future, but he's a very interesting talent. So you look at those kinds of moves and you think, yeah, that absolutely. If it was a past season, yeah, make him GM of the year. Absolutely. But this season, I don't quite think we have as much of the body of evidence of decision-making and moves that, for me, moves that needle and makes him the best candidate for this award. But I'll be perfectly honest. In terms of my own interest, I don't know that I necessarily care. I'll still hope that Chevy wins it, because whether I think he deserves it or not, if he does, it's cool, right? The Jets getting more awards is cool with me. I may think that he has some qualifications that don't quite put him in the same tier as some of the other guys, but I think, he's done a very good job. And if he wins it, that's pretty neat, right? The Jets sweeping all the summer awards, that's fine with me, right? Even if I may have some personal quibbles about some of the choices along the way, I will still lobby for our guys to come away with their names on some pretty sweet trophies. But curious to know how you feel about this particular season from Chevy. How much of this team's success do you think was set in place before? How much do you think was active decisions made this season? I'm very much of the mindset that, the table setting is what led it to this point, but maybe you disagree. Drop your thoughts in comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, Chevy may have had a rough season in my mind this year, but I think this summer and next season could be the bigger moments in his career. He's got a huge set of choices to make, some really tough decisions, and some real upgrades that this team needs. And one of those positions remains with the top four of the defense. This offseason could be very interesting because there are some very big names that might be available for trade or free signings. We'll chat about that in just a brief moment, but before we do, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Monarch Money. Have you checked your bank account and wondered where the heck all your money went? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, though, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building your wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized I was spending a lot more on subscription streaming services and stuff than I realized, and it was very helpful to sort of trim those down, cut down your spending, and make better use of your finances. And it's all in one spot, so you don't have to juggle tons of different apps. If you've got a spouse or partner, there are also collaborative tools so you can help set goals and stay on the same page at all times. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about the fact that the Jets kind of need to bring in a big defender, right? Yesterday, we talked about the Jets bringing in a big center. Now it's time for our GM of the Year finalists to swing big and bring in a top 4 defender. Now, this is a much harder challenge because the Jets also don't have nearly as many open spots that I think the team sees as an issue to upgrade here, right? My personal opinion, the Jets have a right side that's not that strong, relatively speaking, and really needs a huge player, but I don't know if the Jets necessarily agree with that. DeMello has been a steadfast member of this team for many years now. He is obviously just starting his real big contract, and you look at Pionk just extending as well. I don't think Winnipeg thinks its right side is an issue, and I'm not sure that I agree with that. You know, I look at how this team played in the postseason and some signs of slowing down in the regular season, and I'm like, yeah, this Jets right side could be a real issue over the next couple of years as guys really start to slow down and age out. And I think it's going to happen fast. And so for the Jets, internally, right, if we're looking at blue line upgrades that are going to happen sometime in the next couple of seasons, you know, the most obvious one is Elias Salamonson. If the Jets don't try to do anything externally, Salamonson's probably a good season or two away. At that point, you know, DeMello's going to start taking less and less minutes is my guess. I think that they've sort of forecasted that DeMello's decline is probably going to happen in the next 3 seasons. It's already starting in my mind, but I think there's a point at which they're like, okay, he literally cannot play with Morrissey anymore. And so the fact that they're talking about Sandberg as a role model for me makes me think that they really do think Salamonson is closer than he is far. And if that's the case, and if they're really that high on him, then, you know, the Jets might not really swing big for a trade. Where I kind of differ in my mindset is that I look at Winnipeg's roster and I look at the age distribution, and a lot of guys are in their early 30s. Hellebuck is not getting younger, neither is Scheifele. And so, you know, having to wait for your prospects to make this lineup, I don't think is the way you can do this anymore. I think the Jets actually need to bring in somebody right now to try and really bolster this team because you need them to be able to make a run next season. Obviously, I said a lot throughout this year that this had to be the season. I don't think they quite accomplished that goal the way that they were hoping for. You know, in a lot of ways, they ticked off many of the boxes, but I think the guys will feel a level of unfulfillment and maybe slight disappointment with how it ended in the postseason. You know, I think back to the trade deadline, and I took a lot of flack for saying it didn't go well, and actually in some ways said it was a disaster. That in a roundabout way ended up coming true, but even in the moment, you heard Scott Arniel say that he was disappointed when the Nelson news broke. I had heard separately that Nelson had actually already been contacted by Arniel, so I thought that there was a full expectation of him coming. So, you know, that didn't work out. But this is a moment where the Jets can really swing big and bring in a big defender. And I've got 2 guys that kind of come to mind. The first is a very easy target in many ways. Not easy because I think the Jets can actually bring him in, but because he's probably one of those ripe for targeting candidates, given his age, mid-ish 20s now, and the fact that he's an expiring RFA. That, of course, is Noah Dobson. We've talked about Dobson before, and he will be a very, very, very sought after name and very expensive. Now, the Islanders typically do not trade away a lot of their young blue liners. It's just not their model. They are a team that will sign guys until they die a New York Islander. It's just their thing, right? With the new management, though, I sort of wonder if that's going to be the case. They just appointed their new GM now, and so I don't really know what his track record is. We'll have to do some digging to see if he's had any minor league experience and see what his sort of thought process is. But if he knows that they have to make some really big upgrades and make some changes around the squad, then the Jets might be a really easy trade partner. Winnipeg's got a lot of really solid futures to work with. He can honestly get a fairly big quantity of stuff out of Winnipeg, exchanging maybe one piece like Dobson and maybe even one of their centers for a bunch of really good assets and futures that they can use to start, building their resource pool for the future. I think the Islanders really need a lot of stuff, not only just high quality, but high quantity. They don't have that much in their prospect system. They really need good quality players from, superstar talents all the way down to middle of the rotation kinds of guys. And Winnipeg can provide at least some of that, even if it's not everything. But given where the Isles are and what their situation is, I sort of wonder if they look at Dobson as a guy that they can't trade for, brand name recognition kind of stuff because they think that they can turn this around faster. I'm looking at this roster right now, and I can tell you it's not going to be a fast turnaround. So by the time that the Isles are actually ready to do anything of relevance, Dobson's probably going to be in his early 30s, and that's assuming that everything goes really well. My mind, I think that this team is really needing to just tear it down. There's no way that this squad is competitive. It will not be good enough going forward, and as much as Dobson might have been considered a critical piece of this team, a couple seasons ago and even now, I just don't think that he really fits their timeline. There aren't many players that, are in their mid-20s now who are really going to be that great by the time your rebuild finishes. And if Dobson maybe wants to seek better shores, I think he did change his agent representation this year. Winnipeg really makes a lot of sense. The Jets have a huge need for a big right shot D and a strong puck mover. I don't know if the Jets would agree with that, but that's kind of where I sit, right? I think he could be a huge transformative player. I'd be curious to know what the cost would be. It'd probably be very, very hefty, is my guess. A talent like Dobson really doesn't become available all that often, but I wonder if you package it with, say, an Anders Lee or something, does that start to lessen the price, right? If you take some of that salary off of the Islanders for the upcoming seasons so that they can actually turn it into maybe a situation where they can bring on some dead salary from other teams. Maybe Winnipeg can kind of scratch the Isles back too, while also perhaps getting a middle or top 6 upgrade, at least for the upcoming season, until they figure out some sort of a longer-term plan for their center situation. So there's a lot of stuff to work with here, and I think that there's actually some mutual alignment of interests between the Islanders and Jets, but whether that team actually wants to make a deal with the Jets, we'll have to see. The other guy that I've sort of talked about a little bit, and this fits not as neat, but it's a guy I wouldn't mind. It's Thomas Chabot. Chabot is signed for a couple more seasons. He's a huge player with not only in physical stature, but also in terms of offensive impact and skating. He is a tremendous two-way defender with a booming release. And, the biggest problem with him is that not only is he a lefty, but, I think the Sens aren't really in a rush to trade him. He's been one of their strongest players for many years now, and I think the biggest problem for him is that he wasted a lot of his best seasons on a Sens team that just wasn't very good. And so now that everyone else is starting to finally catch up, his decline has maybe started a little bit. I still think he's very good. I think that sometimes he gets caught on highlights where he maybe struggles with the back check or something, but I think overall, if you're looking at him for the next couple of seasons, he is an elite upgrade for any team that can try and find a way to fit him. For Winnipeg, the reason that I don't know if this is really possible is he predominantly does play that left side, and the Jets actually have a fairly elite left side. Barring the third pairing, which I think the Jets could resolve internally, you look at Morrissey and Sandberg, those two guys together are awesome. They are one of the best 1-2 punches in the NHL when it comes to your left-sided D. So Chabot would have to be comfortable either playing on his offside or somebody else takes his spot there. And so that's where I'm not quite sure about the fit. But if he is comfortable playing on the right side, I would 100% pursue that. For some reason, I seem to remember that he has in the past and that he did it relatively well. I could be mistaken, but if that's the case, I think the Jets should be calling the Sens. I think Ottawa is kind of in a similar position in some ways to a team like Buffalo, where they've got a fair bit of stuff that works kind of well, but you look at some parts of the roster, and for some reason, there are too many, moments where maybe guys like Pinto or some of these other players haven't quite been able to step up and become that next level player. So there could be something, right? Maybe a culture change for the Sens. Maybe they make some swaps here and there. Maybe Chabot's one of those guys who they feel has done his time and done his service, but doesn't really fit in their long-term future. So something to keep an eye out for. Obviously, Chabot does have some trade protection he'd have to waive, and I don't know how he feels about Winnipeg, but given that he's been in Ottawa, I can't imagine that he doesn't feel or that he would feel uncomfortable moving to a city like Winnipeg. It's not like Ottawa is like the craziest place out there, so if he would maybe consider giving Winnipeg a shot, especially for the next couple of seasons, I think that he would find a lot of reasons to really enjoy being a Jet. But I'm curious to know how you feel about a couple of these guys. What other defenders are out there that you're thinking about? I know Bowen Byram's going to come up. I will talk about Byram probably later this summer, but for a lot of reasons, I think the Jets would be wise to stay away. He, to me, is just a younger Pionk. And if you know how I feel about Pionk, you probably understand how I feel a little bit about Byram's potential risks. So bear that in mind before you comment. But of course, well, aside from maybe trading for some guys, the Jets could also try and sign some players. We'll chat about whether or not there are anyone or any names out there that are worth signing, especially in free agency, in just a brief moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us as we are chatting a little bit about maybe some potential upgrades for Winnipeg's blue line. And now it's time to talk a little bit more about some of the free agents. We've talked a little bit about one free agent, Dobson. His contract is obviously, coming up for expiration and needs a renewal this offseason with him being an RFA. And that could be a tricky situation for the Islanders. It's why I thought he made a lot of sense to target. But in terms of the free agent market, this is technically one of the better free agent seasons that we've seen when it comes to defenders. Now, if I'm the Jets, this is a part of the market that I am probably avoiding. When I look at the names that are available, there's not a lot out there that really makes me happy. Some of the top names include Brent Burns, Dmitry Orlov, Aaron Ekblad, Ivan Provorov, Vladislav Gavrikov. And so it's not like it's all bad, but I think that there's a really big risk of the team maybe making a big commitment to a player that doesn't really merit the sort of extension that some of these guys will be looking for. Ekblad is kind of interesting, but at this point, he's really in not the best physical shape anymore. He's been injured a lot, and I don't know how much that has impacted his ability to play. His numbers have kind of been dipping over the past couple of years. Do I think he's still good? Yes, I think he'd be very good for the Jets. I think if you're looking for a top four, really powerful right-sided D, he is legitimately one of the better options on the market. But the problem with Ekblad is that, again, he gets hurt a lot, and he's going to be looking for a lot of money. And I think given what the Jets are likely to do with his deployments, he probably wouldn't be thrilled with that. DeMello, I think, has precedence right now. Would DeMello get bumped? Probably. I could see that happening. But I think with how the Jets tend to look at their deep pairings, they always like one big puck mover and one big defensively oriented guy. And Ekblad kind of fits more on the puck mover side. And so for that reason, I don't really feel like he fits all that well into Winnipeg's system and approach. And I also think he wants to be a top pairing guy somewhere else. So I can't really see that being a fit. Probably wants too much money anyways. Burns, no. I think Burns has to be retiring soon, right? Like, he's been around for forever, and, he's just not himself anymore. He's at the age where he is not great. Orlov, lefty, unfortunately, if he'd been on the right side, I'd probably feel a little more open to it, but kind of, like Burns, he's also slowing down, and I think the Canes have had a tougher time trying to work around that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like right-sided defenders, there's just not a huge number of really good ones. CC is probably one of the bigger free agent names, and yeah, I think we all know how I feel about Cody CC. Not my personal pick. There is a name, though, that I think is going to get some real interest, and I don't know if the Jets would necessarily do this, but Dante Fabro is a guy that I would have a ton of time for. Now, I wouldn't be shocked if he does stay with Columbus, but Fabro was really good in their top four. I've kind of been one of those Fabro truthers for a while now because he tends to be one of those not huge defenders who does put up really good puck moving and transition numbers and also has a relatively stable defensive impact because, again, he controls the puck fairly well. Fabro is also kind of in a really favorable age range. He's, just about to turn 27 here shortly. But again, he's at a prime age. He's a very good puck moving two-way, right-handed blue liner who's really not been given expensive contracts in the past. And if the Jets were to take advantage of his potential, I think that he could fit in beautifully on this team, especially if you're trying to figure out what to do about your third pairing. And even then, you might be able to do it to maybe a pairing where you don't have to use it only like 8 or 9 minutes. If you have a Fabro and somebody decent on the left side, you could actually get closer to second pairing minutes with that duo. So, there's some real thought process for me there where I like, having flexibility with your D pairings and guys who can really move the puck effectively. Ethan Bear at some point might have been able to do that. I don't know what he's like now. And so I don't know if I'd necessarily be looking at him necessarily right now. I think he at one point was a very exciting young player, and there were some moments with the Oilers where I thought he had a lot of fun. I thought that he could be a really cool top four upgrade for the Jets, but injuries and stuff have really limited his ability to grow. And at this stage of his career, I don't know if he really fits in. But if he does come to the Jets, he could be a really interesting cultural fit. I think that there's some intrigue for the third pairing. And if he can sort of rehab his career and do well in some limited minutes for the Jets, maybe Winnipeg can start to grow his role. I don't know, right? This is one of those sort of, I wouldn't say it's a risky gamble, but it's kind of like one of those things where it's a low buy-in, potentially modest reward, right? I wouldn't expect the world from him. I think Fabro is the more clear free agent for me that I would target, but I'm sure a lot of teams are thinking the same thing. So not putting any expectations there, but outside of that, you start to realize that after, look at some of these other names, there's really not anyone else out there who's all that interesting. Maybe Connor Timmins, if you think he can do your third pairing stuff. His rights are also coming up for expiration pretty soon. But otherwise, yeah, I think the Jets are not going to find a lot on the open free agent market that's super intriguing. You run the risk of signing a player who's really not going to improve your blue line. And I think the Jets kind of need to get younger and faster on the back end. So tend to avoid free agency for this reason. I really don't think that there's too many guys here that fit other than maybe a Fabro, or if you want to take a swing, a Bear. Otherwise, look at the trades. I think the trade market has the best potential for the Jets to come away with something. Probably one of the harder things for the Jets to pull off as well. So I think 2C is probably going to be one of their biggest priorities. And if that's all they come up with, I don't mind that. I think that the Jets can kind of get away with their defense as is, because as a team, they still defend very well, even if their blue line has kind of been a little ramshackle from injuries. But hey, if they can find a way to bring in somebody who really improves this top six, I would be thrilled, especially for that puck movement on the back end. But curious to know your thoughts. Are there other free agents that you're interested in? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I'm going to push some of our playoff updates probably until early next week. We'll make that a little bit of a sidebar, but mostly focus on perhaps some other Jets upgrades that the team needs to consider making. We'll chat about that all on Monday and beyond. But for tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have. Thank you for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here next week, so see you then. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.